In 1993, America's Midwest was struck by one of the most devastating floods in the country's history. It's known as the Great Flood of 1993, and you'd know it was bad if they didn't even bother to put a location in the title, since no other flood that year was even close. 30,000 square miles of land were flooded, creating $12 to $16 billion of damages at the time. It even took the lives of 50 people. But when everything was over, something surprising came to light. A huge chunk of the flooding may have been caused by a single man, and he allegedly did it because he wanted to keep partying. The man in question is James Jimmy Scott from the town of Quincy, Illinois, which is right up against the Mississippi River. The town has about 40,000 residents and 73 police officers, but it sounds like half of those cops were only there to keep an eye on Jimmy Scott, who had quite the criminal history. By the time he was 23, Jimmy had spent time in 6 different prisons. He had been arrested several times for burglary and twice for arson. When he was 12, he burned down his elementary school. And when he was 18, he went on a fire-starting spree that burned down a garage and sent him to prison for 7 years. So yeah, this guy was a real pillar of the community. By 1993, Jimmy was 23 years old, out on parole, and looking for a fresh start. He got a job at a local Burger King and, according to one newspaper, spent his nights, quote, drinking like Keith Richards. Which is only charming if you can also play guitar like Keith Richards. But Jimmy was holding down a job, and for him that was pretty good progress. But despite his best efforts to turn his life around, Jimmy's fate had already been set in stone 2 years prior, when a volcano called Mount Pinatubo erupted in the Philippines. The volcanic winter that followed is believed to have caused above-average rainfall and soil moisture in the American Midwest, which ultimately resulted in the Great Flood of 1993. And please don't ask me to explain that more, because I can't. This isn't a science channel. It's barely a video essay channel. Anyway, by July of 1993, all that rainfall had caused a tremendous amount of pressure on the levees of the Mississippi River. So the people of Quincy had been volunteering their time to help reinforce their local levee. Among them was our friend Jimmy Scott, supposedly trying to repair his reputation with the people of Quincy. He later said he was hoping that, quote, they'll see me down there and then say to themselves, Jimmy's not that bad. Jimmy's a good kid. Jimmy can do good. But no good came from Jimmy's presence. He spent most of July 16th working on the levee and the surrounding area. That evening, the levee broke unexpectedly. As a result, 14,000 acres were flooded, covering the west side of Quincy. In the process, a river barge was sucked into the flooding and slammed into a gas station, causing an explosion. Nobody was killed in the Quincy flooding, but a big chunk of the town was destroyed, along with thousands of acres of farmland. In the immediate aftermath, a TV reporter from Quincy's local news station arrived on the scene to cover the incident. She was told by workers from the Department of Transportation that she should talk to the first man on the scene, who happened to be old Jimmy Scott. And Jimmy was happy to oblige, doing a live TV interview with the reporter in which he explained that he had seen a weak spot on the levee and put extra sandbags on it. Then he went out for a drink, he is the Keith Richards of drinking after all, and when he returned, the levee had burst. Maybe by doing this interview, the people of Quincy would see that Jimmy was trying to help. But there was one man watching the news who didn't quite buy it. Sergeant Neil Baker of the Quincy Police Department saw the interview and immediately became suspicious. Like I said, the Quincy police were very familiar with Jimmy after his history of burglary and arson, to the point that Sergeant Baker even knew Jimmy's mannerisms and believed he was lying by how nervous he appeared during the interview. Baker later said, "My antennae were raised as I listened to him. He can't answer these simple questions, and the fact that he's over there to begin with made me scratch my head." So based on that suspicion alone, he launched an investigation into the collapse of the Quincy levee, with Jimmy Scott as the #1 suspect. This is how small-town detectives operate, by the way. Just pure vibes. On October 1st, 2.5 months after the levee broke, Sergeant Baker showed up at Burger King when Jimmy was finishing his shift and brought the young man in for police questioning. They told him he was a suspect in a burglary, but that was just a lie so Baker could blindside him with the levee stuff. But Jimmy maintained his story that he had moved some sandbags with the intention of helping. The Quincy Police Department released him the next morning, but they still weren't happy. And in his continued search for evidence against Jimmy, Sergeant Baker stumbled upon Joe Flax, another Quincy resident with a criminal history. Flax claimed that he ran into Jimmy at a party on the night of the flood, where Jimmy allegedly told him that he had tampered with the levee with the intention of causing a flood so that he could strand his wife on the other side of the river and party for the rest of the night. And I know you were probably not expecting Jimmy to have a wife, but he flirted like Keith Richards too. His wife Susie was working at a truck stop in Missouri on the other side of the Mississippi. When the flood happened, it destroyed all bridges across the river for 200 miles. And Flax claimed that Jimmy intended for this to happen so he could party and have an affair while Susie remained stranded in Missouri. And if all of that is true, then Jimmy Scott is clearly extremely morally depraved and also an absolute party legend. I mean, this guy was willing to flood his hometown to keep the party going. You're telling me you wouldn't stay for one more round if someone did all that? Pass me a Miller Lite. Anyway, this was a very serious accusation, so the whole thing went to court. The story got picked up by national media, and the people of Quincy were enraged at the idea that Jimmy might have caused this intentionally. With all the public backlash, the trial was moved to Kirksville, Missouri, a town 68 miles away, because the people of Quincy were absolutely furious about this, but not furious enough to drive 68 miles. During the trial, Jimmy's attorneys argued that what happened to the levee had nothing to do with Jimmy. A soil science expert testified that there are 6 scenarios which can cause a levee to collapse, and the West Quincy levee met all 6. But the prosecution was able to find multiple witnesses from the party that night who claimed to have heard Jimmy bragging about destroying the levee. Beyond the stuff about partying it up, he also allegedly said that if the river were to flood, the fishing in Quincy would be spectacular. It sounds like all Jimmy really wanted was to drink all night and fish all day. And you can't convict a man for being a good time. Pass me a Miller Lite. But they did ultimately convict him after a 4-hour deliberation by the jury. It was originally unclear what he would be charged with, but conveniently there was an obscure Missouri law from 1979 that made it illegal to intentionally cause a catastrophe. So Jimmy Scott became the first and only person ever convicted under that law, which must have been extremely vindicating for the guy who forced them to pass that law in the 70s for no reason. Jimmy was given a sentence of 10 years to life for causing this catastrophe. He appealed it, and the conviction was thrown out, only for them to repeat the case and have the same sentence upheld. To make the whole thing worse, in the time between the flood and Jimmy's arrest, he was also convicted of another burglary. You're really not making the case for your innocence easy here, Jimbo. He was given a 10-year sentence for the burglary before they even convicted him on the flooding thing. And this was not one of those situations where the sentences run simultaneously, so he ended up getting a total sentence of 20 years to life. And for the people of Quincy, that was satisfying enough. The man who caused their town to be flooded so he could drink, cheat, and go fishing was finally locked up. So everyone basically moved on. But over the years, Jimmy's story began to attract attention from reporters and writers who believed it may have been a miscarriage of justice. The theory is that Joe Flax, who was in his own legal trouble, lied in court in return for better treatment from Sergeant Baker. And the other witnesses might have also benefited from lying. Among those who testified against Jimmy was the president of the Fabius River Drainage District, who also happened to be the largest owner of land directly affected by the flood. And since the flood was determined to be an act of vandalism, he received an insurance payout that he wouldn't have gotten if it was a natural disaster. And none of this was disclosed during the trial. As for the other witnesses, maybe they just didn't like him or something. Journalism professor Adam Pitluck has since written a book about Jimmy's story called Damned to Eternity, which feels like a bit of an intense title. Could have saved that one for a book about Sisyphus. In 2013, Jimmy was interviewed in prison, where he maintained his innocence. He said, "I was asked before by guys here, and actually family and friends, If you had to do it all over again, would you go back to West Quincy on July 16th? Yes, I would. Which feels like objectively the wrong answer in this situation, but who am I to say? While in prison, he has fought and gone into remission for Hodgkin's lymphoma, and as of 2013 was training dogs at the Jefferson City Correctional Center. Susie, by the way, divorced him shortly after his conviction. Sorry to break it to everyone who was really hoping they would go the distance. Whether or not Jimmy is innocent remains a mystery, and I'll leave it up to you to decide. Either way, he's now been in prison for over 30 years. He'll be eligible for parole in 2026, so we'll see if everyone's gotten over the Great Flood. But if he does get released, you just know the party he throws will be the biggest that Quincy has ever seen. And when that day comes, for the love of God, somebody better pass me a Miller Lite. Now please consider subscribing, or I'll introduce you to the Keith Richards of flooding your house.